the way that he intersected with people. And I was trying to think this week about the collision that Jesus makes when he comes into somebody's life, and I couldn't think of a way to describe that. And so I was typing in collision, trying to find something, and of course then just showing you car wrecks and everything, and that's not really what I was wanting to say at all. But it got me on a whole tangent of thought here about the way most of our lives is dealing with the collisions that we all have to kind of run into and run across. Now, certainly, collisions have great power. Scientifically, I mean, you can throw an extra neutron at an atom, and if you do it in just the right way and in just the right controlled environment, you can produce energy out of something like that for a whole nation, out of just a very small piece of metal. On the other end of it, though, if that gets out of control, that one collision can start a chain reaction that can destroy a whole city, can destroy a great big area to where it wouldn't be usable again for several lifetimes. The power of a collision, just one intersection, one person coming into another person, can be devastating. You know, whether it be something like a car wreck or even just you've got an agenda for your day, or a plan for your day or your week or your life, and then somebody else has a different plan, and their plan keeps intersecting with yours. And maybe you feel that at work, or you feel that in church, or you feel that in your neighborhood, feel that in family, feel that in a marriage. And you're trying to push for one thing, and you just constantly find yourself frustrated by the other person, just one collision after another. Collisions have great power just to devastate and to destroy. I found this picture online when I was looking for it. The Hubble telescope found two galaxies colliding into one another, and you can imagine all the devastation. But for the most part, these galaxies colliding into each other didn't affect me at all, not nearly as much as one person holding a grudge against me did, not nearly as much as one person saying some slander about me behind my back. You know, sometimes the stuff that really knocks me around and really devastates my life might seem to you to be nothing at all, but it does quite a bit of damage to me. When I was thinking about collisions too, this popped up, this notion here. Scientifically, it's called an elastic collision because nothing is destroyed by it. Everything springs off from it. The cue ball strikes the number one ball there, and if you know what you're doing, if you're smart with how you hit the cue ball, you can determine exactly where the number one ball will go. The yellow ball will go exactly where you intend for it to go, and you can even determine where the white ball will end up for your second shot. And we can do that because there's no agency with the balls. I mean, they always are going to react pretty much the same way, no matter what. As long as you provide the right impetus, the right amount of pressure, you can predict real close what it's going to be. And at some level, when what I'm talking about, Jesus colliding with people, it can be like that. He comes in and he intersects with your life, and he prods you or pushes you or gives you a bit of attention. But you're not as predictable as the number one ball. You're not as predictable as the cue ball there. Sometimes God can smack you or give you a certain amount of whatever, and you may or may not go the direction God wants you to go. And in that moment, a lot of dominoes fall. In that moment, based on what you do or don't do, a lot of things spring out of that. I was thinking about when it first occurred to me to become a Christian. It really wasn't something I had thought about. And my mom and dad started attending a church, and the youth group there was pretty active at church camp, and they asked me if I wanted to go to it, and I didn't want to go to it. I was a pretty shy kid, and I thought that'd be miserable to be all week long. And really, when you know about me a little bit, it's still remarkable that I like going to camp. It's a strange thing because I still am a lot of the same kid I always was. But I was nervous about it. But when they brought it up to us and said, "Hey, would you like to do it?" My brother Scott, who's a lot more adventurous than I ever was, he said, "That sounds fun. Let's go." But he was too young. He's a year too young to go. So we called the camp to see if they would let us. It was the last week of the summer, and would they let him go a year early? And they said, "Sure, come on." And because they did, I went to camp. I almost certainly wouldn't have went to camp if he hadn't, and I wouldn't have become a Christian then at the end of the week, and I wouldn't have Well, who knows then? With that domino, how many different things? I probably wouldn't have married who I married. My kids and grandkids, all of those different lives would be different because of that decision. I mean, and it's all those years ago, and whoever took the phone call doesn't remember it. I'm sure they don't, because why would they? But somebody there at camp, this call comes in and says, "Hey, will you make an exception for this one kid?" And they don't have to make the exception. The rules are the rules. You know, they could say no, but for whatever reason they don't. And because they let that happen, a lot of other things work out. And I'm so grateful that they did. You think about coming to this church. And 15 years ago, Julia and I applied to go to a church here in southern Indiana. And it wasn't this church. And they said, "Oh, we'd be thrilled to have you come." And we talked, and it looked real good. And finally, at the end of talking, they said, "No, we're not going to go that direction." And it was pretty heartbreaking to Julia and I, because we really thought God was calling us to come back to California, and we couldn't figure out why that didn't work out. And it was really upsetting. And you don't know why things work the way they do, but it was still like, "God, what are you trying to do here?" It just seemed like everything was lining up for something there. Again, like a cue ball. And it seemed like everything was lining up, and then it doesn't work out, and you can't figure out what God's doing or what God's not doing. And then a couple months after that, Gary Baker called, and a couple of the leaders here at the church called and said, "Hey, we'd like you to apply to our church." They called us out of the blue, and we didn't even know you guys were looking, and said, "We'd like you to come to our church." And we talked about it, and it sounded like a good thing, and we got kind of excited, and finally asked them, "Well, how'd you even hear about us? We're in California." They said, "Well, this other church that turned you down, we talked to them, and they said they liked you a lot, so we'd like to talk to you about it." And it wasn't quite like that, but it was almost like that, and it worked out. And what a cool thing that it did. I mean, it's been the best ministry we've ever had, and it's done so much for us, and I hope we've been good to you too. And it just seemed like God had something going on, but we didn't see it at the time. We didn't, and I guess I should mention, most of the time when God does stuff, you don't see it at the time. It'll seem silly. It'll seem out of your character, out of your gift set, out of your ability. Most of the time when God whispers and says, "Hey, I want you to go do that," it won't immediately be what you jump towards. And I hope that at the end of this sermon, you can have a better sense of when that happens, A, and then be more willing to respond to it, B. And so that's what the sermon's about. So here we go. One day, Jesus was teaching, and he was by the Lake of Gennesaret. And the Lake of Gennesaret is also called the Sea of Galilee. If you look at a map of Israel, it's the very top there of Israel. And one day, Jesus is teaching there, and the people were crowding around him, and they're listening to the Word of God, listening to what he has to say. And he's standing there. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by some fishermen who were washing their nets. And so he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and he asked him to put it out a little bit from shore. So Jesus is out there in 3 or 4 feet of water, deep enough that people can't crowd up against him. And he sat down there on the boat, and he taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Hey, let's put this out in the deep water and let it down the nets and catch some fish." And Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night. We haven't caught anything. But because you say so, we'll let the nets down." So I want to think about all the different things that go into Simon's thinking here. Simon will eventually be Simon Peter. And when you think about St. Peter, it's the same guy. And so Simon says, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything." Now, the fishing that they were doing was not rod and reel and a hook. It would have been nets. And the time to do net fishing was at night. The fish would come to the surface of the water, and they would be where you could rake the net across there and catch a bunch. During the day, the fish are all going to the deepest part of the water. They won't be up close where you can do it. And so Simon knows this is a waste of time. Simon knows this is a waste of time. And so he does it anyway, knowing that it's a waste of time. And I think that's interesting. Tom's one of our elders. Tom likes to repair cars. I'm a preacher. I don't repair cars. And if I go to Tom's shop and he's working on something, he says, "I can't figure out exactly why this isn't working." If I were to say, "Well, Tom, have you tried this?" Tom won't even listen to me on that sort of thing, right? He won't even consider whatever good advice I'll have. Stephen Easton is a mechanic, and Stephen was working on something for me, and I asked him, hey, can I help you with something? He says, yeah, go turn on that radio, he says. So, I mean, that's more likely what you're going to want. And so if I were to come in there and say, hey, here's what I think you should do, the guy who knows what they're doing on whatever it is would say, and especially if they know it's a waste of time to listen to me. You know, I know more about this than you do. I know exactly what you're saying and how that's going to work. But Simon says, okay, let's do it. I think that's interesting. Because Simon's not expecting to get fish out of this. That's not what he's thinking will happen. So I think that's interesting. I think Simon, I don't know what Simon's wanting, but he knows he won't get fish out of it. That's so I think Simon might be doing it to just try to get on Jesus' good side. Jesus, you know, I really think a lot of you, and if you want me to do it, I'll do it. Won't do any good, but if you ask for it, we'll do it. That might be what's going on. It might be that he's maybe Jesus is going to do something else, you know. Maybe Jesus just wants to test him, see if he'll be obedient. Okay, so I'll let you know I'm the right kind of guy. But he doesn't think anything good, because you wouldn't think anything's good going to come out of it. That's not what you'd think. So I think that's interesting. And then the whole day, remember at the very beginning of this thing, a couple of verses ago, he's been washing his nets while Jesus is talking. I mean, he's been fishing all night. Now the next day, washing all the salt and all the stuff out of the nets so they'll last longer. He's probably close to done when Jesus says, hey, let's put the nets back into the water again. And you could imagine a person being pretty frustrated about that. I think I would be frustrated about that, and I think most people would. If you had just washed the car and somebody says, hey, let's take it out in the mud and see what she can do. I mean, you just finished, right? I mean, it's the wrong time to come and bring that up. If you'd talked to me an hour ago, 2 hours ago, 3 hours ago, maybe I would have. But now because once he throws them in so what Simon's agreeing to here is not just a waste of time. It's a waste of time, but it's a waste of time it's going to take 2 or 3 hours to fix after we're done. It's not just a waste of time, but it's a waste of time it's going to take the rest of my afternoon. And again, he's already been up all night fishing, and he didn't catch anything, so he's probably in a ticked-off mood anyway. And then they're going to spend so a lot of it's interesting. And you pick up a little bit about Simon in this thing here anyway. There's no way he can think this is going to do any good at all, and yet he'll do it. He knows it's going to create more work for him. He's probably going to look foolish to every other boat on the water, but he'll do it. If you ask me to do it, Jesus, I'll do it. And Simon's not necessarily a follower here yet. It says master, but you should probably read that more like sir, like you'd call somebody sir. He's not worshiping Jesus there. It's just, hey, boss, because you say so. It's more that kind of a thing. And if that's what you want, then I'll do it. I think all of it's interesting. And I think you can pick up a lot about Simon and how he answers and how he responds and how he thinks. Well, when they did it, when Simon and his brother, when they tossed we learn in another place, Andrew's helping him. When Simon and Andrew tossed out the net there, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come over and help them. And they came and they filled both boats to the point where they started to sink. And when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and he said, get away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. Now, at first, when the fish just start jumping in, you're excited about it, right? And you're trying to move them in best you can or get them in the right place, get them out of the net into your boat. When they're jumping into the boat and the boats are starting to sink, you're still working hard as you can. Okay, this is the best catch we've ever had. Somewhere in the middle of all the excitement of what that would be to a fisherman, all right? If you're a fisherman, you can't imagine how awesome this would be. It occurs to Simon, we're watching a miracle here. At first, he just thinks, what a lucky break. And then he thinks, man, this is the best fishing. And then he realizes, okay, something's going on, right? He doesn't catch it right off because you're just so busy dealing with it. But once he's dealt with it and he realizes, he turns and looks at Jesus and he knows what's going on. And he says, you need to move on. Now, there's a couple possibilities here. There's some guys who think that what Simon's saying is, listen, I know what you're about. I don't want any part of it. That he's just turning Jesus down. I see what kind of guy you are. I want nothing to do with this. And that's possible. It is. But I don't think it's likely because at the end of this thing, he's going to follow Jesus. I think it's more likely that what he's saying to Jesus here is, I'm a mess. And you may not know it now, but if we work together more than just a couple hours, you're going to see it. And you're going to see what kind of guy I am. And you're going to see how I operate. And you're going to see sooner or later, Jesus, you're going to tell me to get lost. And so let's just cut this off ahead of time. Let's not even go down this road. Because sooner or later, you're going to see what I'm like, and you're going to want to go a different direction. Now, that part, notice, here, let's finish it up. When he says all that, he and his companions, they were astonished at all the fish they caught. All of them realized something's going on, what's happening here. And Jesus says to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you're going to catch people. He's not afraid of the fish. What's he afraid of? He's afraid of letting Jesus down. That's what Jesus is answering here. Simon says, hey, I want no part of this. I'm a mess. Don't be afraid, he says. You know, if we were in a car ride, me and 3 or 4 guys, any 3 or 4 guys in here, and we all knew each other, we're on a car ride, and I'd say, hey, the church is thinking about doing whatever. We've got this new idea, we're thinking about doing whatever. I think you guys would be awesome to jump in there and help with that, right? And if one of the guys, when I'm saying that, says, oh man, not me, my life's too much of a mess, the other guys in the car would all say, oh, no, you're fine, you're being too hard on yourself, don't worry about it, hey, we all got issues. If somebody said, I don't think I can, he says, my family's a mess, or I don't think I can, I'm too angry, or I don't think I can. I guess they could toss out something to be large enough we'd all gasp. But for the most part, you try to say, hey, it isn't that big a deal, right? Notice that Jesus doesn't do that, right? He doesn't say, oh, it's no big deal, Simon. You not got that much wrong. He kind of agrees with him. Lord, get away from me. I'm a sinful man. Well, yeah, but don't be scared about that, he says. Jesus knows what he's getting into when he intersects with you. When he's coming in and you're coming in, David Crowder said, when my depravity meets his divinity, in that intersection point, when my depravity meets his divinity, what happens next? Well, I'm still a mess, and Jesus sees that. He's not blind to it. He knows who I am. He knows what I am. He knows what I do. He's not fooled by it. When my depravity intersects with his divinity, he's taken me as I am. Don't be afraid, he says. I've got big plans for you. And I think that's still true for you. Don't be afraid, he says. I've got big plans for you. This story pops up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew's version of it, he says, come follow me, and I'll send you out. And I like this partly because of the action verbs. He challenges you to come close to him and learn to do what he does. He's not assuming you already know it. Come to me, he says. Learn how to live like I live. Come to me. Follow me, he says. And I'll send you. If I were to tell any one of you that you need to talk to your friend or your family or your wife or husband or your neighbor or whatever, you need to start sharing faith with this person, or you need to talk to this person and apologize, or you need to talk to this person and try to build something, or you need to talk to them, you need to take a risk here and say something to whoever it is. You need to do that. If I get somebody to tell me no, like I say to Chuck, hey, you need to do this, and Chuck says to me no, Chuck's reasons are normally one of two things. Either he'll say, I'm not good enough to do that. I'm not smart enough. I wouldn't know what to say. I don't have that talent. I don't have that gift. He would say to me pretty much what Peter said, get away from me. I'm a mess. Or if I said, hey, Chuck, I need you to go do this thing. I think you'd be the very guy to do it. Chuck will think, like Simon did, well, that's stupid. It'll never work. That'll never work. He might even say something like, well, I tried that 10 years ago and it didn't work then. We already did this sort of thing. I'm just no good at that. But Jesus says, come follow me. You draw close to me, and I'm going to send you to do things. And I think you should expect, if it really is him calling, for him to miraculously come through for you often, just like he did for Simon. I think part of the story is that if Simon could be productive when every bit of logic said he shouldn't have been, then God can certainly make you productive if you'll take the chance. And again, that the risk then for you is whether or not you're going to respond. It's not whether if you respond you'll fail, because God will take care of that. The risk is whether or not you'll respond. And again, thinking about that pool analogy again, the cue ball is God, and he hits the ball. If the ball had no agency, it would go right where God wants it to go, but he gives you agency. So God intersects with your life, and will you do what you're supposed to do or not? It's a hard thing. It's especially hard because we don't always know when that is. Sometimes there'll be a nudge. You'll feel it real strong. You need to say something. You need to say something. You need to apologize. You need to jump in there and say what you think of this person in a good way. You know, it amazes me a dad or a mom who could tell their kid that they're proud of them because they are proud of them. But they never get around to saying that because it's just steady criticism all day long. And you know you're supposed to say something, but you don't, or vice versa. A kid who's just completely distant and aloof, and they know they should, but you don't say it. You know it, you feel it, but you don't do it. The nudge is there, the push is there, and yet, for whatever reason, you don't respond. Is that God or is that just you? And it's hard to know. To me, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but to me, often, one of the real tests about whether it's God is, does it seem foolish? Does it seem like it won't work? Does it seem like it won't gain you anything to jump off that cliff? That's not necessarily saying that it's God, but that's a good sign. I've sat in churches before, and you have too, where a preacher will get up or an associate minister will get up and say he's taking another church because that other church is going to pay him more money and it's a bigger church. And God has called me to this, he'll say. And I think to myself when I'm in the audience, you don't need God's help for that decision. You know, I've taken a big promotion at work. God has called me to. No, you don't need guidance for that. Somebody's offered me more money. I'm going to take it. That's not help. I don't need God for that. And I get nervous of people who talk real easy about that sort of stuff. You know, look at me. I live in this awesome house, and my family is all picture perfect, and we've got 2 great-looking cars in the driveway, and money just rolling in left and right, #blessed. I always get skeptical of that kind of stuff. Look at what God is just leading me to left and right. Aren't I awesome? And isn't God awesome for doing it too? And I don't know that I believe in that kind of stuff. I don't think you need help for that. I think where I need help is when I'm driving by someone with a cardboard sign, and I don't want to give them money at all, and God says, you should help this man. Because that's not how my mind works. That's not how my heart works. Where's that thought come from? That's not from me. That don't sound like me at all, right? It's that kind of stuff. You should say something. You should do something. I already told you that's not how I'm wired. I'm the guy who sits on the edge of the dance floor and watches everybody else dance. I'm not the guy out there throwing down. I'm not. That's not me at all. And I have all the same excuses that Peter did. God, I don't know. I've tried this sort of thing before. It never works for me. God, I don't know. I don't think I'm smart enough or good enough to do that kind of thing. And again, how do you know if it's God? I would rather take a risk on it being God 10 times and be wrong than to miss one when God says to move. And again, there's all different levels of foolish. There's going to Jiffy Treat and getting an ice cream shake and pouring it on your head to see, you know, there's playing stupid pranks on one another. There's driving 80 in a 35-mile-an-hour zone. There's all kinds of stupid, foolish things. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the thing that God's challenging you to do to make the world better, to make his kingdom grow, and it's intense, and you can feel it just for a moment. There's a story in the Old Testament about a lady named Esther, and it's kind of a long story. If you've never heard it, it's fantastic. She's got her own book, and it's an amazing story. But the gist of the story, if I can just give you the short version of it, is Esther wins this bizarre and kind of ugly beauty contest to become the queen of the nation. She becomes the queen of Persia. But she's still, even though she's done all that, she's still a second-class citizen, because women are second-class citizens in Persia, in ancient Persia. And she's not even allowed to go talk to her husband unless he asks for her to come. She can't even go talk to him unless he says, come over. And Esther's a Jew. That's why she's in the Bible at all. And there's lots of laws about the Jews, and one law in particular that looks like it's going to be an ancient Holocaust against the Jews. And so her uncle Mordecai goes to her and says, hey, you should say something to the king, get this stopped. And she says, well, I'd love to do that, but you know the rules is like I know the rules. If I go talk to the king and he's not invited me in first, I could be killed. And Mordecai tosses this gem at her. He says, well, who knows that you've not come to your royal position for such a time as this? Maybe the only reason why you are a queen is so that you can take this risk. Maybe the only reason why you're in your spot at all is so you can do this thing. And she does do it, and it does work out. But the whole crux of the book is right here. Will you respond when you don't know for sure? Who knows? Maybe the reason why you're in this place, in this church, in this time, is to do something, and not just to be here. Maybe, you're the pool ball on the table. Maybe God's trying to move you someplace. There's another story in the Bible. The Israelites are freed from Egypt, and they're going across the desert, and God's told me He'll give them a promised land, and God has done so many awesome things for them. If you read the stories in the beginning of Exodus there and into Leviticus and Numbers, God He's visibly with them all the time. They can look and see this pillar of a cloud, this long column of a cloud that stands up over the temple, and at night the column of a cloud turns into a pillar of fire. They can look and see God in the camp. Every morning, God rains bread down on the ground for them to eat, and every so often brings meat in for them to eat. Just brings it in, and they can have meat. There's a water source that travels with them. It says in Corinthians, travels with them. There's water wherever they want to. He's just taking care of them left and right, and they can see Him right there all the time. And they get to the edge of the promised land, and the nerves start creeping in. And they say to Moses, hey, why don't we send some guys over there first and take a look at it, see what we're getting ourselves into? And Moses says, fine. So they send some guys over there, and they come back, and they report. And they say, well, here's what's going on. And Caleb is one of the guys who reports. He's one of the guys who says something. Now, there may be some Calebs in here. If you are Caleb and you're in here, not meant to be a dig or an insult. But when I get into this thing about Caleb, names in Jewish culture were supposed to mean something. Because here's a kid, we look at this kid, here's his future, and they would name him something. Usually something pretty like God is my fortress, or God has a plan, or God's going to save, or they would usually give him a name like that. Or Sarah means, as a Bible name, princess. We'll look at Sarah, princess. And Cain, like Cain and Abel, Cain, I brought a man. It means acquired and strength, and I brought a man. It usually means, Caleb means dog. So I don't know, when Caleb was first born, the kid, you picture mom and dad, Caleb, and that's what they name him there at the very beginning. Just take a look at him. Or maybe it wasn't how he looked at all. Maybe he had that kind of dog mentality, right? His whole life, he's just attacking things. He's just that kind of dude. Because why they name people what they named him in that time. It's an unusual name in that time period. And he becomes famous. So there's lots of Calebs after that, but he's the first one we see there, and he kind of all intensity. And Caleb goes into the deal, and he comes back, and he silences the people and says, hey, listen, we ought to go up and do this thing. He says, we can surely do it. But the people who had gone with Caleb said, we can't do it. We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. He says, we saw giants over there, descendants of Anak. And we don't know who Anak is, but apparently he was a giant. And they were all scared of it. And they said, we can't do anything about Anak. He says, next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And I'm sure that's what they thought too. We just a bunch of dwarves out there, and then they were giants. And so Caleb, dog again, just challenging the whole crowd, calms them down, says, listen, if the Lord is pleased with us, then he'll lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he'll give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord. He says, don't be afraid of the people of this land, because we're gonna swallow them. He says their protection's gone, but the Lord is with us. So don't be afraid of them. But the people, it says, they talked about stoning Caleb when he's talking that way. And then God appears in a big, powerful way. He's already there, but like just shadows his glory all over the camp. Nobody can talk because God's presence is so heavy on everybody. And God argues with him. And at the end of the argument, he says, I've forgiven you, but none of you guys are getting to go in. I mean, I've just carried you like a baby through the desert. We get to the very end here, and you won't go. Well, fine. He says, we're going to go back out to the desert then. And everybody, every adult who was too scared to go, you're all going to die out there in the desert. Your kids will go in, but you all, but except, he said, but because my servant Caleb had a different spirit, and he follows me wholeheartedly, well, I'm going to bring him into the land that he went to, and his descendants will inherit. Power of a moment, right? Now, it says, I'm not going to read this to you, but the next morning, all the Israelites got up and said, we're sorry, God, and they tried to go in anyway, and God was not blessing them. He was not behind them, and the people beat those grasshoppers back into the desert. They only had the power, they only had the strength when God was with them, and that moment came, and that moment passed, and there's no way to get that moment back. Now, 40 years later, all those adults have died, and they're into the promised land, and they're marching around, and we meet Caleb again. And Caleb says to Joshua, he says, now then, just like the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years. Since that time that he said to Moses, when Israel's moving about there in the wilderness. And he said, here I am today, 85 years old, and I'm still just as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go do battle as I was then. And I'm going to tell you, when I read this story, I doubt that's true. Maybe in his head he still felt 20, but I bet he was 85, and I bet he felt 85 most of the time. I bet he didn't. Maybe he had a little bit of a unnatural long life, but I think you're kind of seeing the dog attitude in him again too. I mean, I'm finally getting a chance to do what I always wanted to do. He says, give me the hill country. Give me the very worst parts, he says, that the Lord promised to me on that day. You yourself heard that the Anakites were there and their cities were large and fortified, but Lord willing, he says, I'll go get them. And he gave it to him, and Caleb did do it. Conquered all that area, and it belongs to him and his descendants. Why? Because he followed the Lord God of Israel wholeheartedly. But then there's this in parentheses there at the bottom. Hebron, that's the city he took over, used to be called Kiriath Arba after Arba. He was the greatest among the Anakites. Remember, the Anakites were the giants. Those were the guys that they were also scared of. The giant amongst giants. And Caleb was able to beat it. Why? Because he was so strong? No, he's an 85-year-old man. Because he was so much talented? No. I mean, he's called Dog. I mean, remember the TV show, the Bounty Hunter? That's who we're talking about. It wasn't because he was so bright, right? It wasn't because he had so much going on. What did he have? He's just willing to go. If God wants me to go, I'll go. If God will make it happen, I know it'll happen, and I'll just take God up on that thing. And again, it's not like there's a roadmap. It's not like God is making it obvious. He's just burning in his heart. And when people feel that and they respond, God will move. What kept Peter going? Simon, at the very beginning, he was willing to cast his nets even when he thought it was silly, foolish. It wouldn't do any good. He was willing to follow Jesus. He didn't argue with Jesus about whether it makes sense or not. If Jesus told him to do it, he does it. If Jesus tells him to do it, he goes. And he was humble. He knew that he was a mess, and he knew that Jesus wasn't. And so he put his stock in Jesus. And he was committed. After all that story with Simon goes, it says he left his nets, he left his boats, and he went and followed Jesus. Now, I'm not advocating that any of you follow Simon's example to the letter here, but it's worth thinking about what Simon's example was. I don't know if there were CPAs back in that day, but if Simon had a CPA and he goes to his CPA and he says, I've decided I'm going to switch careers. And the CPA says, well, great. Okay, well, let's talk about your risk and what we're getting into. He says, okay. He says, I'm going to get out of fishing altogether. Okay. We're going to sell the boats? No, I'm just going to walk away from them. I'm just going to leave it. Just going to walk away from it and let somebody else have it. Okay. Well, what are you going to do next? Well, I'm just going to go wherever Jesus tells me. We'll just see how that works out. What do you think advice he would get from his financial accountant? What advice do you think he would get from anybody? Are you sure? This seems stupid. This seems silly. This almost certainly won't work. Again, I'm not telling any of you to do that, just like Simon did. I'm not. But it is worth thinking about what Simon did. I mean, when he became convinced that Jesus wanted it, then it didn't matter what it cost. I mean, if there is a God in heaven and he's got a plan for your life, when you realize you're on the road, then it doesn't matter what it costs. It doesn't matter what the risk is. God's got this. It just doesn't matter. When I see somebody who has a plan that they feel like God has put on their heart and it's not going to bring them any glory, right? It's almost guaranteed to produce more work and headache for them. I usually get excited about that kind of stuff. It's very easy to have a plan that's going to create more work for somebody else. It's very easy to have a plan that's going to make you look good. It's very hard to just be God's servant. And especially when you don't think you're going to catch anything. I think that's an amazing thing. So as we get to the end of the service here, I just want you to think about one possibility. Who knows why you're here today? I mean, really, anything in the world could have kept you away. It's what Rennie said in communion. You know, your funeral will be determined by the weather, how many people come. Anything in the world could have kept you home today. The time change could have done it, for crying out loud. I mean, anything in the world could have knocked you backwards, and yet here you are. I know for some people, quite honestly, won't feel like God's needling them at all this morning. If anything, you're just a little tired, like to get home, get a nap, and fine. I mean, that's not bad. I've been there, so don't feel bad about that at all. If that's where you're at, that's a great thing. But I bet there's at least a few people who at one thing or another really do feel like God's nudging them. You know, that you've just been content to have a marriage that's only at half power, or relationship with your kids or your parents or your friends or your neighbors, it's only about half power. You're going to feel some pressure. There's some people you need to be talking to. You're going to feel a gap between the life that Jesus promises and the life that you have. You know, a life filled with peace and power and purpose, and you don't have any of those things. And you can put on a face for it, but you know you don't. And you feel that gap. And you're here this morning, and you feel that gap. And what will you do next? That moment is everything. So we're going to pray here together, give you a chance to think through this thing. And I'll have some people up in the front afterward, and I just encourage you to pray. It may not be about you. You may have somebody else on your heart, just real strong, and come pray for them. It may be for our whole church. Maybe you're feeling what I'm feeling when I'm preaching this sermon, that I feel like God is pushing us. We're just not listening to it enough. And so if that's you, and it's not really about you, but it's about our whole church, come pray about that. But take advantage of this moment and lift God up. One thing that can be kind of a hard thing to hear as a preacher is when I'm out front after the service, somebody come and say, man, I wanted to go forward, but I just couldn't do it today. And I'm just like, man, when that moment comes, don't be the guy who doesn't respond. So let me pray for you, and then we'll close with a couple of songs. Dear Lord God, I thank you for this group. And I pray, Father, if there's anybody here who needs to draw close to you, that you give them the courage to do that. If there's anybody here, God, that needs to speak up maybe even to the people they came with today, that you give them the courage to do it, even if they're worried they'll look foolish or stupid. If there's somebody, God, who needs to speak up to neighbors or friends or tell other people about you, then I pray you give them the courage and the strength to do that. God, whatever it is that you're needling somebody about today, I pray that they're humble enough to listen and willing, God, to follow whatever it is that you're pushing them to do. In Jesus' name, amen.